Figuring out whether your watercolor painting is finished or not can be one of the hardest parts of watercolor painting, but there are clues that can help you. I can think of 7 signs that might suggest that it's time to put the paintbrush down because your watercolor painting is actually finished. Let's paint and chat about those. I'm working in a little watercolor sketchbook that I'm going to put together once I finished painting all the pages. There's a bit of a story about that, and I've been making a playlist about it, so I'll pop that link up in the cards in case you're interested. But I'm starting to just put in a couple of wildflowers in watercolor across the width of this page. So it's going to be a typical project where it can be hard to know when to stop because you can just keep adding and adding. You know, one of the things you might hear about painting or artwork in general is that artwork is never actually finished, it's just abandoned. So that's not particularly helpful advice when you find yourself at the end of a painting and you're wondering whether to keep going or not. Like most things about painting, it's all highly subjective and personal, but I think there are a couple of things that are quite helpful if you're finding it hard to figure out whether or not to stop painting. Clue number 1 is that you found yourself asking the question, should I stop yet? Typically, if you've asked the question, the answer is probably yes. The chances are that if you've got the slightest inkling that your painting might be finished, it probably is. I've also heard the advice that you should stop half an hour before you meant to. It's funny, but it's not particularly helpful, is it? But the point is, you often don't need to put in as much detail as you think, particularly if you choose to favor the sort of loose, expressive style that I find so joyful to paint with. By the way, if loosening up your watercolor painting is something that you'd like a little bit of help with, I do have a free guide that's got 7 tips that should really help you out. Whether you're just beginning or returning to watercolor after a bit of a break, you'll find encouragement, ideas, and inspiration to paint more freely and with more joy. I'll pop the links up in the card and in the description below so you can grab your free copy now. The second clue comes from the kind of results you're getting from the extra marks you're currently adding. Are they making the watercolor painting better or worse? There comes a point in the watercolor painting process where you find yourself making tiny adjustments to your work. A firmer line here, a softer edge there, perhaps reinforcing a darker value. It's an exciting part of the painting because it's often at this point that things are starting to really come to life. But eventually there comes a point where the marks you're adding are actually not making things better anymore. So if you're fiddling for the sake of fiddling and the marks you're adding are starting to make the painting look worse, not better, then it's definitely time to stop. I think the third clue is when your subject is finally recognizable. When you begin a painting, you have a subject in mind. One of the best ways, in my opinion, to know when you're done is when that subject reveals itself. As I say, I love a loose approach as opposed to, say, a hyper-realistic style. So for me, this can happen quite soon in the process. I think that as soon as the subject is obvious, the painting has said all it needs to say. Only you know your intended subject. If you were painting something like a realistic portrait, then you're finished as soon as you've achieved the likeness that you were hoping for. But if you're painting something else and trying to capture more of the mood, the feeling, the sense of a place, perhaps, then it can be a little bit more difficult to make this decision. But also, if it's the mood and the feeling and the sense of the place that are actually your intended subject, then how can you really go wrong? For the fourth clue, you might need a mirror. I'm lucky enough to paint in a spare bedroom in my house, so there happens to be a mirrored wardrobe at the end of the room. So very often I take my painting and I hold it up to the mirror and I can see my painting, but in a slightly new light. It is a curious thing, but when you hold something up to the mirror and see it in reverse, all sorts of things that you didn't notice before suddenly pop out at you. It's like getting a fresh pair of eyes. When you look at something in a mirror, the proportions start to seem a little bit different. And I think one of the other things that has happened naturally by looking through a mirror is that you've put a bit of extra distance between you and the painting. That's also very helpful. So even without a mirror, taking a moment to kind of stand back from your painting, view it from a little bit more of a distance, gives you a little bit of a better perspective, literally and figuratively. And from a renewed perspective, it might be a little bit easier to assess your progress with your painting. If clue number 4 involved a mirror, for clue number 5, you can get out your phone. I know, we're never very far from our phones these days, and actually, your phone, the camera on your phone, can be quite a helpful painting aid. It's really working in a very similar way to the mirror. If you take a couple of photos of your image, seeing your painting through the lens of the camera tends to focus your attention in a slightly different way. It's the same sort of thing we were talking about with the mirror. Try it and see for yourself. You might hear artists explain that they know when it's done because it's a feeling, a gut instinct. I think this is actually quite important. Part of the appeal of making art in the first place, at least to my mind, is that you get a chance to practice trusting your inner voice. So if you have a bit of a sense of completion, a feeling of satisfaction, then your watercolor is definitely finished. And finally, one of the best things you can probably do is walk away for a bit. By the time you get towards the end of a painting, sometimes you get the feeling that you can't really see the wood for the trees. Sometimes it can be a bit of an intense process. Intense but fun, of course. But if you've been really close to it for a long time, sometimes it's very helpful to just take a little break and walk away for a bit. Make a cup of tea, go and do something else for a bit. When you return, you'll have those fresh eyes, and you might be in a much better position to make a more confident declaration that your painting is finished. But what if you don't want to stop painting? Sometimes we said the painting process can be quite intense and you need to take a bit of a break from it. But there are other times when you're having so much fun, you just really don't want to stop. This is usually the point where you start worrying about the advice you've heard of not overworking your painting. It's good advice, but remember, the best advice for all painting is to make sure you're having fun. If you're wondering whether to stop but are still enjoying painting, and you still have some ideas of extra things to add to your watercolor, I think you should go right ahead. Of course, we worry that we're going to ruin our painting. And what of it? If you do end up thinking that you've ruined the painting, surely you'll just paint another one. From my perspective, it's the actual painting part, the process itself, that is so enjoyable. And I value that so much more than the finished product. So if I'm still enjoying painting, I'm definitely going to keep going, whether it's going to mean a bit of overworking or not. At the end of the day, every painting is really an experiment. It's in playing and trying new things that we learn. So I think that any sort of fear that keeps us from that spirit of play and experimentation is unhelpful. We have to be able to learn to trust our instincts, and I think that just comes from experience. Let's do more painting and less judging. Answering the question of whether your painting is finished or not is something every artist has to decide for themselves. I think a painting is finished when you, the painter, declares it to be so. You are, after all, the boss of your painting, and you have every right to leave it half incomplete or completely overwork it and decide to start again. The most important thing is to just keep painting and enjoying the process. Figuring out how to finish a painting is definitely a hard part of painting. The other hard part of painting is starting a painting. We all know how daunting that blank page can be, but there are so many options. I came up with 5 different ways to start a watercolor painting, and I showed you all of them in a video I made recently. I'm going to pop it up on the screen and you can watch that one next. Happy painting!